Chapter 1. A quiet visit to Linwood Chase. "You cannot tell me that this tea is not dreadful," said Hercule Poirot, raising his cup delicately and peering into it as though expecting to find the truth. Hiding at the bottom, Colonel Amesbury gave a wheezy chuckle. "It's the water, old chap. Something in the pipes. You'll grow used to it." "I would sooner grow used to murder," Poirot replied mildly. Setting the cup aside with fastidious care, they sat in the Colonel's modest drawing-room. The armchairs were worn, the fire weak, but there was a comfort in the silence broken only by the occasional crack of wood. Poirot had been in Linwood Chase for 2 days now, enjoying what he called an experiment in countryside peace. The air was damp, the conversation limited, and the Colonel's cook had a peculiar talent for burning even boiled eggs. But the detective welcomed the calm until now. A knock at the door disrupted the stillness. "Bit late for visitors," muttered the Colonel, rising to answer. A maid entered, breathless. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's trouble up at the Barrington house." Poirot tilted his head. "Trouble?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Eleanor screaming they heard, and now she's been found dead. In the attic, they say." The Colonel's brow furrowed. "Dead? Good Lord. Eleanor Barrington?" Poirot stood, brushing off an invisible speck from his cuff. Perhaps this peace was only the calm before the storm. Mon ami. They arrived at Barrington Manor minutes later. The house was large but sagging with age, windows like watchful eyes. Several villagers lingered near the gate, whispering behind gloved hands. Inspector Harwood was already there, speaking briskly with a doctor just outside the front door. "She's gone, then?" asked Colonel Amesbury. "Heart failure," Harwood replied. "Dr. Mallory says it must have come on sudden. She was alone in the attic." "Alone?" Poirot echoed, stepping forward. "If I may ask, monsieur, how was she discovered?" The inspector sighed. "Housekeeper found her. Harriet Foyle. Came up when Mrs. Barrington didn't come down for supper. Found her in a chair, eyes wide, looked frightened. Old lady probably startled herself with a mirror." Harwood gave Poirot a faintly irritated look. "We've got it. In hand." "Been, sir," said Poirot, nodding. "And yet, if you do not mind, I am a man of habit. Curiosity is one of them." Before Harwood could protest, Colonel Amesbury interjected. "Let him look, Inspector. I've known Eleanor nearly 20 years. If something's not right, Poirot will find it." The inspector relented with a short shrug. "Upstairs. 3rd door at the end. Mind your head, the ceiling's low." The attic was dusty, the air stale. A single chair sat beneath the sloped ceiling. Eleanor Barrington's body remained where it was found, respectfully untouched. Her head had slumped to one side, her fingers curled over the armrest. Poirot stood still. He made no sound. He simply looked. The candle on the nearby table was curious. Not directly beside her, but set well out of reach, as though placed by someone else. His eyes drifted to the family trunk in the corner. Lid open, contents rumpled. Poirot knelt. One hand hovered just above the floor. A faint scuff mark near the window. Not large. Just enough to suggest someone had turned suddenly, perhaps pivoted. The doctor had mentioned no bruising. No sign of violence, yet fear had twisted her features. Poirot straightened and turned to find Harriet Foyle in the doorway, wringing her apron with trembling hands. "I told her that attic wasn't safe," she whispered. "Damp up here. Cold." She insisted, said she needed to look at her papers. "Papers?" Poirot asked. She kept old letters, family ones, from years back. Her voice faltered. She'd been sorting through them lately, seemed determined. Poirot's gaze drifted back to the trunk. "I understand she removed you from her will, mademoiselle," he said gently. Harriet's face colored. "I didn't care about that, not truly. I served her 20 years. I raised her nephews. She said I wasn't loyal, but I—" "Calm yourself," said Poirot kindly. "You are not on trial." Footsteps on the stairs signaled someone else arriving. Gregory Barrington, Eleanor's brother, appeared at the doorway. "Foyle," he said sharply, "you're not disturbing things, I hope?" Poirot interjected. "Monsieur Barrington, I am Hercule Poirot." Gregory's expression shifted slightly. "I've heard the name." He glanced at his sister's body, lips pressing into a thin line. She had a weak heart, should have been resting. "Where were you this evening, monsieur?" asked Poirot. "Walking," Gregory replied. "Near the church, alone." Poirot looked at his polished leather shoes. Recently brushed, no mud, but a faint dampness clung to the soles. "You were close to your sister." Gregory gave a sharp laugh. "Close is one word. She returned from Italy, full of secrets and schemes, demanding this, rewriting that. She liked control, and people let her have it until they didn't." Poirot noted the way he avoided looking at the trunk. "I understand she planned changes to the will. She threatened everyone with it." Gregory snapped. "Even Harriet here said none of us deserved a penny. That the estate belonged to her, and her alone." Poirot nodded slowly, as though filing each word away. "Did she mention what she found in her letters?" Gregory stiffened. "Old nonsense. Family quarrels. She thought they still mattered." Poirot stepped aside, allowing the two to pass. He remained behind, alone with the silence. On the walk back, Colonel Amesbury kept glancing at Poirot. "You think it's more than heart failure, don't you?" "I think," said Poirot, "that fear does not twist the face of the dead without cause. That candle, for instance, was too far to light easily, and that trunket was searched. Not rummaged, but searched." "You believe someone wanted something?" Poirot didn't answer directly. He glanced up at the sky, now heavy with fog. "Tell me, Colonel, do you know if the attic ever had a gas fitting?" "Years ago. It's not been used in ages." Poirot's steps slowed, and yet the pipe remains. Back in his guest room, Poirot removed his gloves and placed them neatly on the table. He sat for a moment, staring out the small window toward the Barrington Manor, now dark and still, a shadow in the attic. Someone had said, a ghost, perhaps. He did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in shadows, and someone, he suspected, was hiding within Chapter 2. "Death in the attic, you're early," Inspector Harwood muttered as Poirot entered the drawing room of Barrington Manor the next morning. "Some of us have work to do, monsieur." Poirot gave a polite bow. "And I am here to assist only with observation, of course. One must not disturb the delicate order of official investigation." Harwood grunted, but said no more. He was busy going through Eleanor Barrington's papers, laid out across a small table near the hearth. No sign of struggle, no wounds. Doctor says natural death, though he admits the expression on her face was odd. Poirot nodded. Terror, perhaps, or surprise. I would be most interested to know what she was doing in the attic alone. She went up often, apparently, Harwood replied. Housekeeper says she'd taken to reading old letters, sorting through family records. Bit of a recluse lately. Poirot walked to the window, then turned abruptly. And what of the candle? What candle? The one found burning near her body, Poirot said calmly, placed far from her chair. Why light it and then sit across the room? Harwood frowned. Didn't think of that. Strange. I suppose might have set it down and changed her mind. Perhaps, said Poirot non-committally. And yet one does not usually forget fire. Harriet Foyle entered carrying a tray of teacups. Her hands trembled faintly. Poirot observed her carefully. How are you this morning, mademoiselle? She avoided his gaze, trying to keep busy. Sir, it's all so sudden. I still can't believe she's gone. You were fond of Madame Barrington. Harriet hesitated. Yes, though she could be. Cruel with her words. She had her ways. You understand. Controlling. But I served her with loyalty. Even when she changed her will, she flinched. I never saw the paper. But yes, she mentioned it. Said I was no longer useful. She wanted to leave everything to some historical trust. Said the family didn't deserve the estate. Poirot tilted his head. And that did not upset you? I'm human, monsieur. It stung. But I wouldn't harm her. Harwood cleared his throat. We're still looking for that will. If she rewrote it, it's vanished. Poirot said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the staircase toward the attic. Later that morning, Gregory Barrington appeared at the doorway, perfectly composed, arms folded. I trust we're not still speculating about nonsense, he said flatly. Poirot smiled. Speculation, Monsieur Barrington, is often the seed of truth. I was wondering about your walk last night. You said it was near the church. Yes. Between 8 and 9. I needed air. Eleanor had been ranting earlier about disinheriting everyone again. You returned by the front. No. Through the side garden. Less fuss. Poirot walked closer. And your shoes. Gregory blinked. What about them? Poirot gestured. They are polished, but the soles are damp and the edge scuffed only on the left. Odd, is it not? Gregory's jaw tightened. It's the countryside. Things get muddy. Poirot nodded gently, but only on one side. Before Gregory could answer, a new voice chimed in from behind. Oh, but it was a ghost, I'm sure of it, said Lydia Gray dramatically, sweeping into the room like a gust of wind caught in drapery. Harwood groaned. Miss Gray, this is a police matter. She ignored him and addressed Poirot. I saw it, a shadow, moving in the attic window. Just before the scream, Poirot raised an eyebrow. You saw it clearly as moonlight allows, she declared. Tall, moving slowly, pacing, I think. Poirot pressed gently. Do you wear spectacles? Spectacles? Mademoiselle, not at night. It's a romantic hindrance. Poirot glanced at Harwood. Her window faces the manor. Harwood nodded reluctantly. Across the road. Second story. Poirot turned back to Lydia. You are certain it was not a reflection, a candle? Perhaps. She looked momentarily uncertain. Well, it flickered, moved oddly, but it felt like a person. Poirot gave a polite bow. Merci. Mademoiselle Grey, you may have seen something quite important or quite misleading. She beamed. Either way, it sounds thrilling. After she'd gone, Harwood muttered, that woman's been dying for a mystery to happen. Even an unreliable witness may carry a kernel of truth. Poirot replied. She may have seen a flickering candle if not a figure. Harwood narrowed his eyes. And if she did see someone? You think Eleanor wasn't alone? Poirot's reply was measured. I think someone ensured she would die alone. Poirot asked to return to the attic. This time, he brought a small candle and matches. Harwood followed reluctantly. The chair still sat beneath the small round window. The air was colder now, even musty. Poirot lit the candle and placed it where it had been found the night before. He then sat carefully in the same chair Eleanor had used. He looked toward the corner of the room. There, just beneath the windowsill, was a brass valve cap half covered in dust, but unmistakable. He examined it closely. An old gas fitting, Poirot said softly, and recently disturbed. He examined the latch on the attic door, then retrieved a piece of string from his pocket. Harwood watched in silence as Poirot looped the string through the inside lock, passed it through the narrow door gap, and closed the door from outside. Poirot gave a quick tug and the latch clicked into place. Harwood stared. You could lock it from outside. Poirot nodded. With planning, yes, a child's trick, but in the right hands murderous. That afternoon, as Poirot prepared his notes, Colonel Amesbury arrived with news. Julian Marks the vicar came. Calling, the colonel said he'd like to speak with you. Seems Eleanor had some kind of hold over him. Poirot folded his hands. Then perhaps it is time we ask Reverend Marks what, precisely, he feared she might reveal. He looked once more toward the attic, the shadowed window now faint in the dying light. The shadow Miss Grey had seen might not have been real, but the fear that killed Eleanor Barrington most certainly was. Chapter 3. The family gathers come. In, Gregory Barrington said stiffly, not looking up from the sideboard as Poirot entered the morning room. His hand hovered over a decanter of brandy, though the clock read barely past noon. Poirot closed the door gently behind him. Forgive the intrusion, monsieur. I wished to ask a few simple questions. Nothing more. Gregory poured himself a half-measure. I imagine you will, whether I like it or not. You are the lady's brother, her closest kin. It is only natural that we begin there. Gregory sipped, then turned, jaw tight. I told the inspector. I was out walking. I came back, found the house in a state. That's all. Poirot's gaze drifted to the decanter, then to the man's polished shoes, now dry but faintly dulled at the toe. You returned through the side garden. Yes? Yes. Yet you came in through the drawing room. That means passing beneath the attic. Windows. Gregory's eyes narrowed. I fail to see the relevance. Of course, Poirot said gently. Did Madame your sister seem agitated in the hours before her death? She always seemed agitated these days. Gregory snapped, always reading those damned letters, muttering to herself. Half the time I didn't know if she was planning a charitable trust or a hanging. Poirot studied him. You mention letters. May I ask, did she ever speak to you of their contents? Gregory turned to the window, his voice low, only in that vague way she had. Threats wrapped in civility. She implied she held leverage over me. All things long buried. It was her way of maintaining control. You sound, Poirot said softly, as though you hated her. There was silence. Then Gregory gave a short, bitter laugh. Hate is too strong a word. But I certainly didn't love her. Poirot inclined his head politely. Merci, monsieur. You have been most candid. As he stepped into the corridor, he nearly collided with Harriet Foyle. She looked flustered, a tray of clean linen in her hands. Monsieur Poirot, she said, almost whispering, could I speak with you? Privately, Poirot guided her toward the back stairwell, where the air smelled faintly of lavender and damp stone. I heard you asking about the letters, she said. I didn't want to speak yesterday with the inspector listening. You may speak freely, mademoiselle. Harriet's fingers twisted in the cloth. She was keeping them in the attic trunk. She'd go up most nights, sorting them. Some were from before the war. Others I don't know who wrote them. But she treated them like weapons. Did she ever show them to you? Harriet shook her head. No, but I know she threatened Mr. Gregory with something. Said she had proof he wasn't entitled to the estate, and the vicar to she said she could ruin him if he didn't support her plans. Poirot raised a brow. Plans for what? She wanted to build a library, I think, on old church ground. Reverend Marks wouldn't agree, and she changed her will. Harriet nodded, eyes misting. She told me so. She said I was no longer loyal, that she couldn't trust me. I think she knew someone wanted her gone. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then, did you see anyone enter the attic that night? No, she said quickly, but she told me to leave her supper outside the door and not to disturb her. She never said that before. Poirot pressed gently. And did you hear anything? Only the wind. Then the scream. I ran up, but it was too late. Poirot placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Merci, you have been most helpful. By midday, Poirot had summoned Reverend Julian Marks to the manor under the guise of tea and quiet discussion. They met in the study, where the sunlight fell. In narrow beams across the desk, Julian entered with the cautious grace of a man used to funerals. I heard, he said, folding his hat in his lap, that you wished to speak. Only to clarify a few points, Reverend, Poirot said. Madame Barrington, she was pressuring you. Yes. Julian's eyes met his. I'm a man of the cloth, Monsieur Poirot. I'm accustomed to strong personalities. That is not an answer. Julian hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he folded his hands. She knew something about my sister. Years ago, when we were still in London, There was a scandal quieted at the time, but not forgotten by Eleanor. She kept copies of certain documents, and she threatened to reveal them. Julian gave a pained nod. Only if I opposed her plans. She wanted church land for a secular building. I told her no. Poirot leaned in slightly. Did you visit the house that evening? No. Julian said quickly. No. I stayed at the vicarage. I was writing my sermon. Poirot did not press further. He only noted how tightly the vicar's hands gripped his hat, white at the knuckles. That evening, Poirot dined once more with Colonel Amesbury, who had been reading the local paper without enthusiasm. I tell you, the Colonel said, this whole business stinks of buried grudges. That house is like a powder keg. Poirot murmured, each person with a match in hand. The Colonel glanced over his teacup. You've seen something. Poirot nodded slowly. I have seen many things. A candle too far, a valve too old, a face too afraid, a house too quiet. Colonel Amesbury frowned. And the next step. Poirot rose, straightening his cuffs. I must look again at that attic, but this time not with eyes alone. I will listen. The dead often speak, Colonel, but only if one is willing to hear. As he walked out into the night air, the light from Barrington Manor flickered faintly behind him, and in the attic window, the shadow did not return. But something still waited in that room. Something that had killed Eleanor Barrington and left the others with far too much to lose. Chapter 4. Shadows and secrets. Poirot ascended the narrow attic stairs that night with slow, deliberate steps. The house was quieter now, the sort of silence that arrives after morning has settled, not yet replaced by routine. But Poirot knew that silence often had weight and sometimes it concealed truth. He reached the attic door, now unlocked, and gently pushed it open. The air inside was sharp with cold and the faint metallic tang of disuse. The single candle he held threw long shadows across the floorboards. He closed the door softly behind him. His shoes made no sound as he walked to the small family trunk in the corner. The lid still sat ajar from the previous examination. Poirot knelt beside it and began to remove the contents one by one. Old correspondence, a brittle baptismal record, a crumpled estate map from 1892, a monogrammed handkerchief, all seemingly innocent. But Eleanor had kept coming back to this trunk. That, Poirot knew, was not without reason. With a slow, gloved hand, he ran his fingers along the base of the trunk's interior. The wood felt uneven, the grain changing ever so slightly at the bottom. He tapped once, twice, then again. A hollow sound. Poirot murmured. He found the edge, slipped a fingernail beneath a false board, and gently lifted. Beneath lay a shallow compartment. Inside, several envelopes tied with black ribbon, and a folded sheet of parchment bearing Eleanor's seal. Poirot set them aside carefully, and turned his attention to the room itself. The candle flickered. The attic window rattled faintly in the wind. He stepped toward the corner, where the old brass gas valve sat nestled beneath a decaying drapery. The dust around it had been disturbed, brushed, perhaps, but not entirely cleaned. Poirot pulled a small magnifier from his waistcoat pocket and studied the rim. There were tiny indentations, recent ones suggesting use. He looked above the valve to a tiny heating vent embedded in the wall, nearly invisible unless one knew where to look. He moved back toward the chair where Eleanor's body had been found. He'd placed the candle where it had been left the night of her death. From there, one could imagine the flame slowly melting through a string, releasing a mechanism or merely acting as a timing distraction while gas seeped in. Poirot sat in the chair for a moment. From this angle, the corner of the attic where the gas fitting lay was not visible. A person sitting there would not notice it nor smell the gas until it was too late. And the latch? He walked to the door and examined it again. He withdrew a short length of twine from his pocket. He looped it through the latch, stepped outside the attic, and gently pulled the line. The latch clicked shut, locked from the inside. He stood quietly for a long moment, looking back at the door. Someone had planned this carefully. The next morning, Poirot sat at the breakfast table with Colonel Amesbury. The Colonel was reading aloud the latest news from the paper with a certain indignation. "They've called it a family tragedy," he muttered. Said Miss Barrington's health was delicate, and the shock of village life overwhelmed her. Rubbish. Poirot sipped his coffee. "There is something worse than rubbish, mon ami. It is the truth hidden beneath polite lies." He rose, retrieved the documents from the hidden compartment, and laid them on the table. "The new will," he said, unsigned, but witnessed, dated 3 days before her death, leaving the estate not to her brother, nor to Harriet, but to the Historical Preservation Trust of Greater Essex. The Colonel whistled. "She meant business, then." Poirot nodded. "But that is not all. These letters, some are ordinary, but this one," he held up a faded envelope, "is a letter from a solicitor confirming Gregory Barrington's quiet removal from a financial partnership in 1924. The Colonel frowned. "Over the shipping fraud business." Poirot replied. "It appears Eleanor kept that letter all these years, and reminded her brother of it recently." The Colonel rubbed his chin. "So, she had power over him, financially, and with that new will, she'd have cut him off completely." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Now, consider the gas valve. It had been used, the attic sealed. A candle left burning." Colonel Amesbury stiffened. "You think she was murdered, then? Killed with gas?" Poirot nodded. "By someone who knew how the old fittings worked, who needed time to act without being seen, who ensured the body would appear untouched." Later that day, Poirot returned to Barrington Manor and found Inspector Harwood in the study, examining a bundle of household records. "Any progress, Inspector?" Harwood looked up. "No new will. Not officially filed. No foul play, unless you found something new." "I have found everything I need," Poirot said softly, "except the killer's confession." Harwood gave a short laugh. "Then you haven't found everything." Poirot approached the window. Eleanor Barrington was not a woman who kept secrets. She exposed them, piece by piece, until someone decided to silence her. Harwood snorted. "That sounds like something from a novel." "None," Poirot replied. "It is merely logic, and the logic, Inspector, is beginning to speak very loudly." That evening, Poirot sat once more in the attic, alone. with only the newly discovered will resting in his lap and the low creak of the roof beams. For company, he closed his eyes briefly and whispered, "Mademoiselle Eleanor, you knew, and still, you came here, night after night, to sit and remember." He opened his eyes and stared at the faint outline of the gas valve in the corner. "She was not frightened by letters," he said aloud. "She was frightened by what they might provoke. Outside, a storm was gathering, but inside the attic, Poirot could almost hear the past whispering, and he was finally beginning to understand what it was saying. Chapter 5. The Curious Miss Grey. "I brought scones," declared Lydia Grey cheerily, stepping into Colonel Amesbury's parlour as though she'd lived there all her life. "Fig and walnut good for the brain, I'm told." Poirot, seated by the fireplace, looked up from his notebook with polite surprise. "A kind thought, mademoiselle. Although I was under the impression you preferred to bake only when inspired by tragedy." "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she exclaimed, clutching her scarf dramatically. "You wound me. But what else can a poet do in times of upheaval but feed people and record misery in verse?" Colonel Amesbury coughed discreetly behind his paper. Poirot folded his hands, his voice calm. "Then perhaps you will indulge my own curiosity more. Practical than poetic, I fear." Miss Grey settled onto the sofa with unearned comfort. "Of course. You mentioned you saw something the night Madame Barrington died, a shadow in the attic. I did," she said, nodding solemnly. "Just after the clock struck 9, the light in her window flickered, and I saw a figure pacing slowly, not quickly, mind, almost like it was thinking, brooding." "And you are quite certain it was a person?" Poirot pressed. Lydia tilted her head. "It moved. But now that I think of it, it wasn't solid. The silhouette kept changing, almost like it flickered. It could have been candlelight behind. The curtain. I've such an active imagination." Poirot said softly. "The imagination is a gift, but it can also confuse what is true." "Was the window open?" "I believe it was shut. There was a reflection, I think, yes. That's what I saw most clearly. A reflection of the candle flame, possibly. Or perhaps someone was in there and blew it out when they noticed me watching." She leaned forward eagerly. "Do you think it could have been Gregory? He always gives me the impression of a man who keeps secrets in his boots." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are observant, mademoiselle, though I urge caution when naming names." "Oh, I wouldn't say it aloud at church," Lydia replied breezily. "But between us there's something grim about that whole family." Poirot stood. Slowly. "Then you will forgive me, mademoiselle, if I examine the attic window from your vantage point." "You're welcome to look from my bedroom," she offered brightly. "Though I do apologize for the wallpaper. I was experimenting with olive green and regret it terribly." Minutes later, Poirot stood in Miss Grey's upper room, gazing out across the narrow village road to the manor. The attic window, partially obscured by the tree line, was still visible. With the right angle, candlelight would catch the glass and flicker. Colonel Amesbury, standing beside him, peered out with narrowed eyes. It's possible she saw a reflection. Wind could have moved the curtain, or a shadow created by the flame itself. Poirot said quietly, "No figure, only the illusion of movement." "And yet," the colonel murmured, There's something uncomfortable about how she described it. Poirot's reply was soft, because Miss Grey, for all her dramatics, believes what she saw, and that tells us something useful. Someone wanted the illusion to be noticed or not noticed at all, but it was a risk, which suggests confidence or desperation. Back at the manor, Poirot requested another word with Harriet Foyle. She joined him in the study, pale and composed, hands folded in her lap. "You knew Madame Barrington's habits well," he began. "Did she ever mention fearing anyone?" Harriet hesitated. "Not directly. But she was, how can I say it, wary of being betrayed. She often spoke as if people owed her lifelong loyalty." "Did she ever speak of Miss Grey?" Harriet looked faintly amused. "Only to call her a silly bird who knew too much about other people and too little about herself." Poirot smiled, and Gregory, was he close to his sister? "Not in affection," Harriet replied. "But he kept close tabs on her affairs, financial matters, especially." Poirot nodded. "One final question. When you found the body, was the candle still burning?" She nodded. "Yes, almost melted through." Poirot's expression sharpened. "Did you extinguish it?" I think the inspector did. I was too shaken, Monsieur," Poirot said quietly. "That is all for now." Outside in the hallway, Poirot met Inspector Harwood, who appeared weary and none too pleased to see him. "You're chasing shadows now," Harwood muttered. "Ghostly reflections and poetic nonsense." The coroner confirmed the heart gave out. No proof of tampering, no foul play. "Yet I find myself asking," Poirot said mildly, "why a woman with a weak heart chose to spend so many nights in a cold attic, alone, with gas lines still connected." Harwood folded his arms. "You've got theories, but unless you can show me someone turned that valve, it's all just smoke." "Indeed," Poirot said, voice low, "but even smoke leaves a trace. Mon ami." That evening, Poirot requested the housekeeper to light a single candle in the attic and return downstairs. From the garden, he stood with Colonel Amesbury and Miss Grey. The flicker of light in the window was faint but undeniable. "See," Miss Grey said triumphantly. "That's what I saw." Poirot nodded. "But now we must ask, did the killer expect you to see it? Or did they believe the attic would remain hidden in shadow?" Colonel Amesbury gave him a searching look. "Either way, you're certain someone planned it?" Poirot turned away from the manor. "I am certain," he said, "that a heart cannot fail from nothing. And shadows, mon Colonel, do not range themselves." He walked slowly toward the vicarage. It was time Reverend Marks answered a few more questions. Chapter 6. Tension over Reverend Julian Marks welcomed Poirot with the stiffness of a man trying hard. Not to seem uneasy, his study was modest, lined with theological texts and a row of dusty parish records. The tea service sat untouched on a small tray between them, the steam long since vanished. "I wasn't expecting visitors. This late," he said, folding his hands in his lap. "Forgive the hour, Monsieur le Vicaire." Poirot replied gently, "But the truth does not follow a timetable." Marks offered a wan smile. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Poirot leaned forward. You said before that Madame Barrington held something over you. Something to do with your sister. The Reverend's eyes darkened. She had private letters between my sister and a man she had hoped to marry. He left her. Suddenly, a small scandal in London long ago. My family managed to silence it. But Eleanor never forgot, and she threatened to reveal them. She used them as leverage. Yes, to gain my cooperation regarding her plans for the land behind the church. She wanted to build a private library there. It wasn't suitable. I told her so. She insisted. Poirot tilted his head. So you had a motive. But did you have opportunity? Marx met his eyes evenly. I was in my study all that evening, preparing Sunday's sermon. My housekeeper saw me. I never left the vicarage. Poirot made no comment, merely nodded once and shifted the topic. Did you know she had changed her will? I suspected as much. She hinted at it. She always wanted to make a statement before dying. But she never told me who would inherit, only that Gregory would not. Poirot stood and adjusted his gloves. Merci, monsieur. You have been honest, I think. Marx gave a stiff nod. I have nothing more to hide. Poirot turned to the door. And yet, truth, like gas, has a habit of seeping into the smallest cracks. It only takes a single spark. Back at Linwood Chase, Poirot returned to the sitting room where Colonel Amesbury was tending a sluggish fire. Marx's. Frightened, Poirot said quietly, lowering himself into the armchair. But not, I think, of the police. The Colonel looked up. Then what? Of himself? Of what he did not do? Or perhaps of what he suspects someone else has done? Poirot placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. This letter, one of those hidden in the trunk, was written by Eleanor to her solicitor. She believed someone had been entering the attic without her knowledge. She intended to have the lock changed. The Colonel frowned. Then she knew. She was in danger. Not precisely, Poirot said, but she felt it. She had too many enemies in her own home. He stared at the fire for a moment. Tell me, moaned Colonel, what do you know of Gregory's war service? Fair bit, Amesbury replied. Served in logistics. Came home in 17 after injury. Quiet fellow after that. Never married. Took care of the estate. Did he mention the family trust, or speak of money troubles? Occasionally. Eleanor controlled most of it. Gregory always seemed to be. Managing around her. Poirot nodded. Indeed. And then she cut him out entirely. The next morning, Poirot called for a meeting at Barrington Manor. Present were Gregory Barrington, Harriet Foyle, Reverend Marx, Lydia Gray invited, much to Harwood's irritation, Colonel Amesbury, and Inspector Harwood himself. They gathered. In the drawing-room, tension straining every corner of the air. Poirot stood beside the hearth. His voice measured. Madame Barrington died under circumstances too precise to be called natural. I believe she was murdered with gas, released deliberately into the attic where she sat reading old letters. The window was closed, the latch locked, choosing a simple trick, and the candle, placed far from her hand, served a purpose. Gregory leaned forward. That's absurd. Who'd want to kill her? Harwood cut in. We've seen no evidence of tampering. No fingerprints. Nothing in the room points to interference. No, Poirot said, because it was planned to appear as nothing. But someone knew that etiquette's fittings, its silence, and someone was desperate. He turned to Harriet. You, mademoiselle, had been dismissed from her will, yet you continued to serve her. I loved her, Harriet said, her voice trembling. Even when she cast me aside, Poirot nodded. You are loyal, but loyalty can also be used against you. He turned to Reverend Marx. You had your reputation to protect, but you are not a killer. You feared exposure, but not enough to act. Then, to Lydia. And you, mademoiselle, you saw a shadow, or thought you did. You created a witness statement without knowing. But you saw the candle. That was real. Gregory stood. This is madness. Are we just throwing names around now? No, monsieur, Poirot said sharply. We are narrowing them. Poirot approached Gregory. You came in through the side garden that night. Yet your boots bore damp only on one side. That is because you walked along the dry gravel path except where you detoured briefly. You went to the cellar entrance. The old servant's stairs lead directly to the attic. Unused for years, but you knew them. Gregory's face had gone pale. You can't prove that. Poirot's eyes glittered. I do not need to prove it in this room. I need only to make clear what you have already betrayed. He laid the folded parchment on the table. Your sister was about to destroy everything you depended on. Her new will would leave you with nothing. You knew she spent her evenings in the attic. You remembered the old gas valve. You remembered how it could be sealed. You placed the candle. You locked the door. And you walked away, knowing no one would smell the gas from the lower floors. Silence fell. Gregory's lips parted, but no sound came. Then he sat slowly, shoulders slumping. She never gave me a choice, he murmured. I built this house up. I kept the name. She wanted to erase it all with her whims. Poirot said softly, so you erased her instead. Harwood stepped forward, face grim. Gregory Barrington, I'll need you to come with me. As Harwood escorted him from the room, Poirot looked once more toward the attic stairs. The shadow in the attic was gone, but the truth had stepped into the light. Chapter 7. The trunk's final secret drawing room had emptied, save for Poirot, Harriet Foyle, and Colonel Amesbury, who stood quietly near the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the manor with a mournful hush. Harriet's voice trembled as she broke the silence. He really did it, then. I thought Gregory had pride, but not malice. Poirot turned to her gently. Malice is not always loud, mademoiselle. Sometimes it is quiet, calculated, and born from desperation. She lowered her eyes. He said once years ago that he resented having to answer to her, that she kept him on a leash. Poirot nodded. She held the reins, financially, emotionally, and then, with the will she took everything from him. Harriet swallowed hard. But why now? She threatened him for years. Poirot walked to the table where the documents from the attic still lay. He lifted the last of the letters from the hidden compartment, its seal broken only hours ago. The parchment inside was stiff with age, but unmistakably personal. Because, Poirot said softly, This letter made it final. Harriet looked up. "What is it?" Poirot handed it to her, allowing her eyes to scan the neat, slanting script. "My dear Gregory, by the time you read this, you will know what I have done. You forced my hand. I cannot allow you to drag the Barrington name through scandal again. The estate will go to preservation, not to your creditors. Your war record is not the shield you think it is. I kept your secret once, but I cannot do it forever." Harriet stared at the words, lips parted. She was going to ruin him. Completely. Poirot's voice was quiet, and she left it for him to find. In the attic, she knew he read her papers in secret. Colonel Amesbury stepped forward. So, she knew he might kill her. Poirot shook his head. I do not think she believed he would. Eleanor Barrington believed herself untouchable. That was her misjudgment. He turned to Harriet. But the question remains. Mademoiselle, why was the letter still hidden? Harriet frowned. He must not have found it. Nom. Poirot said. He found it, I am sure. But he left it, thinking it would remain buried just as he hoped Eleanor's reputation would be. Colonel Amesbury ran a hand through his greying hair. What happens now? Poirot tucked the letter back into its envelope. Inspector Harwood will send it with the rest of the evidence. There will be no trial. Gregory has confessed. The coroner will amend his report. But the village, he glanced toward the window, where smoke curled from cottage chimneys. We'll remember the Barringtons differently. Harriet whispered. She made so many enemies, and yet I can't help but feel sorry for her. Poirot turned to her, expression unreadable. She was not a kind woman, but she was precise, sharp, and deeply afraid. Afraid of what? Poirot walked toward the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the glowing embers. Of being forgotten, of losing control. That is why she kept those letters. That is why she controlled every legacy, every secret, every coin. Harriet stepped closer. She wasn't always like that, you know. When I first arrived, she was stern. Yes, but she used to laugh. She even gave me a birthday gift once. A brooch shaped like a lily. Poirot's gaze softened. People are rarely only one thing. Mademoiselle, that is what makes murder so tragic. It fixes them forever in a single light. Colonel Amesbury stirred. And what of the house? Poirot looked around the room, the portraits lining the walls, the scent of lavender polish still clinging faintly to the air. It will pass into the hands of the trust, as she wished, likely to become a museum or offices for some historical society. But its shadows will linger. He paused, especially in the attic. Later that afternoon, Poirot stood once more beneath the sloped ceiling of the attic. The candle had long since melted. The gas valve had been sealed permanently by Harwood's orders. But still, the air felt thick with memory. He opened the trunk again, this time not for clues, but for the story it had tried to tell. There was one final envelope, wedged between the baseboard and the lining. Poirot had not seen it before. He drew it out. The writing on the front was unfamiliar, older, looping, fragile. The postmark read 1913. It was addressed to Eleanor Barrington. Inside was a photograph, a young man in military uniform, his smile crooked, his eyes full of something unnameable. On the back was written, "For Eleanor, I'll come back to you. I swear it." Poirot held it carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. So this, too, she had kept, a memory of love, one untouched by bitterness, hidden beneath layers of control and suspicion. She was not entirely hard, Poirot murmured. Footsteps behind him startled him slightly. Harriet stood at the door. "I wondered if you'd still be here." Poirot handed her the photograph, a piece of her heart. Perhaps the one she never spoke of. Harriet stared at the image. "That's Michael Holloway, her fiancé. He died in France. She never talked about him. Perhaps," Poirot said, "she couldn't. To speak of love lost is to feel it again." They stood in silence. Then Poirot said quietly, "Let the past rest now, mademoiselle. Close the trunk. Lock the attic. The house has said all it will." Harriet nodded. "And the shadow?" Poirot turned toward the window, where the light now glowed gold in the late afternoon. "There is no shadow now," he said. "Only the echo of a woman who guarded her name with iron and was undone by what she could not let go." Chapter 8. A quiet departure. Poirot stood by the window in Colonel Amesbury's parlour, hands folded behind his back, watching as a cart from the village approached Barrington Manor. A pair of men climbed down and began loading sealed boxes onto the flatbed. Eleanor Barrington's personal belongings, soon to be archived by the Historical Preservation Trust, an ending of sorts. The Colonel remarked from behind him, refilling a modest glass of sherry. "I imagine the village will take a long time to digest all this." Poirot turned, the faintest of sighs escaping him. "They will digest the gossip, yes, but not the truth. That, I fear, will remain buried beneath layers of polite retelling." Colonel Amesbury raised an eyebrow. "And what would you say the truth is, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot considered. "A woman who wielded fear to preserve power, a brother who broke under pressure, and a household that carried more silence than speech." The Colonel nodded, sipping quietly. "And yet, no one truly weeps for her." "No," Poirot agreed. "But that does not mean she deserved to die as she did." There was a knock at the door. Harriet Foyle stepped in, wearing a coat, too thin for the weather, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I came to say goodbye," she said softly. "They've released me from service. The trust doesn't need a housekeeper." Poirot rose, offering her a gentle nod. "You intend to return to your family?" "I haven't any," she said. Then added with a weak smile, "But I've secured a place in Lavenham. A family there needs a governess." Colonel Amesbury approached and extended his hand. "You serve the Barringtons with dignity, Miss Foyle. Don't let their shadows follow you." She shook his hand gratefully, then turned to Poirot. "Thank you for seeing things clearly. I feared I'd be blamed. I know I wasn't perfect in her eyes." Poirot placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "None of us are perfect in the eyes of the powerful. But you, mademoiselle, remained loyal even when you had no reason to be." Her voice trembled. "I stayed because I thought she needed someone to care. But in the end, I think she only needed someone to fear her." Poirot gave a solemn nod. "And now she fears no one." As she departed, The wind picked up outside, scattering dry leaves across the gravel drive. Poirot watched her go, a solitary figure fading into the grey. That afternoon, Poirot made a final visit to the vicarage. Reverend Marks greeted him in the study with visible relief. "Has it all been settled, then?" Poirot inclined his head. "Gregory Barrington has signed his confession. The coroner will issue a revised report. The trust will assume ownership within the fortnight." Marks nodded slowly. "And what of the village? They will speculate," Poirot said, "as they always do. But your name will not suffer. Miss Barrington never released those letters." The Reverend's posture softened. "Then I owe her something, I suppose." Poirot gave a slight shrug. "She held power, Reverend, and sometimes she used it wisely. But power is not the same as goodness." Marks turned toward the window. "Will you remain long in Linwood?" "I shall depart tomorrow. There are other cases, other crimes. But this one," he paused, "has a particular weight." "Because of the attic?" Marks asked. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Because it was not the attic that killed her. It was everything that came before it. The secrets, the mistrust, the years of manipulation. The attic was only the theatre." Marks nodded slowly. "I shall pray for them all. Even Gregory." Poirot's voice was quiet. "As should we all?" That evening, Poirot and Colonel Amesbury took one final walk through the village. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the churchyard. Miss Lydia Gray, perched on her garden bench, waved as they passed. "Off tomorrow, are you?" she called out. Poirot bowed slightly. "Indeed, mademoiselle. Though I trust no new tragedies shall emerge in my absence." She gave a sly smile. "No promises." "Monsieur Poirot, we are a dramatic little village, after all." As they passed on, Amesbury chuckled. "She'll be writing poetry about this for the next 5 years." Poirot smiled faintly. "Let her. Better that than forget." They reached the gate of Barrington Manor and paused. The shutters had been drawn, the lights within dimmed. Poirot glanced up at the attic window, dark now, empty. "Tell me," Amesbury said, "do you believe Eleanor Barrington ever regretted what she became?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "I believe, at the very end, she tried to reclaim something lost. But pride is a heavy burden. One must let go of it before it crushes what little remains." Amesbury looked up at the dark windows. Perhaps it was already too late. Poirot didn't answer. The next morning, Poirot stood at the station platform, valise in hand. The train was due within the quarter hour. A faint mist clung to the tracks. Harriet Foyle appeared suddenly, a basket in hand. "You'll be needing something warm on the train," she said shyly, handing him a wrapped parcel. Poirot accepted it with grace. "Merci, mademoiselle. You are too kind. I only wish—" She hesitated. "I wish I had said something to her, something real. Not just yes, madam, and right away, madam." Poirot studied her gently. "Sometimes silence is the only kindness a person will accept." The whistle of the train echoed through the valley. Harriet stepped back. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot. Goodbye, Miss Foyle." As the train pulled in, Poirot boarded quietly, his silhouette framed briefly in the carriage doorway before the door slid shut. Through the window, he watched the platform drift away, the village receding behind rising mist and fields of autumn. Gold, and somewhere, far behind him, the attic at Barrington Manor stood empty at last. Chapter 9. A matter of leg aside train rolls steadily through the English countryside. Its rhythmic clatter a distant echo of the storm left behind in Linwood. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the compartment, a folded newspaper on his lap. Though he scarcely glanced at it, his gaze was fixed beyond the window pane, following the blur of hedgerows and passing hills with quiet concentration. His fingers tapped. The envelope beside him, Harriet's parting gift, still unopened. A parcel of bread and cheese, perhaps, or something more sentimental. He chose not to investigate just yet, not until he could appreciate it properly. Across from him, the silence was interrupted only by the occasional whistle of wind through the window's edge. Poirot exhaled. The case is closed, and yet, he paused, then continued aloud. The story does not quite end. It was true. Gregory Barrington's confession had answered the immediate question of Eleanor's death. But as with all carefully layered lives, more remained beneath the surface. Too many years of secrets could not be swept away by a single arrest. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a smaller envelope one. He had slipped from the Barrington trunk, but never shared. It bore no name, only the date, April 1915. Inside was a single letter, penned in a hand distinct from Eleanor's. Neat, severe, and clinical. Eleanor, the matter of Gregory's conduct is resolved. The papers have been destroyed, and the military board will not pursue further inquiry. But I advise you do not speak of it again, if you value his future and your own position in society. You will leave it buried. He must never be allowed to serve again. His condition will not improve. You must understand this. Dr. P. Holloway Poirot read the lines once more, then folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. There it was, the true ghost in the attic, not just financial strain or sibling rivalry, but something older, something untreated. Gregory had not only been weak, he had been unwell. Poirot leaned back in his seat, the thoughts aligning like chess pieces across a familiar board. Eleanor kept his secret not out of kindness, but control. She reminded him of it when it suited her, used it to gain obedience, but also, perhaps, to protect him. And when she wrote that final letter threatening exposure, Gregory had cracked, not from rage, but from fear. Hours later, in London, Poirot returned to his modest flat. He unpacked methodically, laying the trunk, documents in a sealed file, and placing them neatly into a locked drawer in his desk. He paused, then lit a single candle from the envelope Harriet had given him. He withdrew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a thin leather bookmark embossed with a silver lily. A small note accompanied it. She gave this to me once. I thought you should have it. You understood her in a way no one else did. H.F. Poirot held the bookmark between his fingers, then placed it gently into the book resting on his desk. Euripides, in translation. He stared at the flame of the candle. His reflection flickered faintly in the window glass. There was still something that troubled him. And so, the next morning, Poirot paid a visit to the offices of the Historical Preservation Trust of Greater Essex. He was greeted by a brisk woman in spectacles who led him to the archives room. "We've received the Barrington materials, of course," she said, "though some items are still under review. The will was unsigned, so there's a bit of legal wrangling. But the house is being catalogued for public opening by spring." Poirot nodded politely. "May I see the contents from the attic trunk?" She pursed her lips. "Most have been sorted, though a few pieces were deemed sensitive. One document has been withheld at the family solicitor's request." Poirot's brow lifted. "Ah, may I ask what it concerned?" "I shouldn't say," she replied, but with the faintest glint of curiosity, "only that it referred to a private medical diagnosis from the war years relating to Mr. Gregory Barrington." Poirot inclined his head. "I see. Then I suspect I already know what it said." She looked startled. "You do?" "I had merely come to confirm it." That evening, Poirot sat once more in his study, the day's discoveries gently reinforcing what he had already suspected. Gregory Barrington's war trauma, once sealed away by family influence, had gone untreated. What Eleanor believed was control had, in fact, been a long-delayed tragedy waiting to unfold. She had misjudged the limits of his mind. She thought she could pressure him without consequence, and in doing so, she had unknowingly walked into her own carefully arranged death. He looked at the silver lily again, a symbol of beauty, yes, but also of mourning. Poirot extinguished the candle and stood in silence for a moment. In Linwood, the village would soon return to its routines. Miss Grey would write her verses. Reverend Marks would preach of silence and redemption. Harriet would find peace far from musty attics and whispering corridors, and the Barrington name would fade, as all things do, into history. But Poirot would remember not just the crime, but the quiet, flickering sorrow that had caused it. Chapter 10. Lydia's final days in Linwood moved with the quiet resignation of a place eager to forget. The shadow of Eleanor Barrington's death still lingered in hushed tones and lowered glances, but villagers, as they do, returned to hedges, kettles, and small concerns. Miss Lydia Grey, however, did not forget. In the early days of October, she could be seen walking daily to the old churchyard with a small notebook clutched in her gloved hands. She claimed it was to visit her aunt's grave, but the villagers suspected correctly that she was working on her poem. Miss Grey's writing again. Mrs. Tilling told the butcher one morning, "Terrible business with the Barringtons, but it's got her inspired, poor thing." Inside the ivy-wrapped cottage she called home, Lydia scribbled fiercely into the night. Scraps of paper littered her desk, each one scratched out with frustration, until finally on the fifth night she wrote a single line and didn't strike it through. The shadow in the attic never truly left. It merely followed the quiet. Once home, satisfied, she set her pen down. The next morning, Lydia requested a visit with Reverend Marks. She stood in his drawing room, her hair slightly disheveled, cheeks flushed from the wind. "I finished it," she announced, holding out the folded paper like a holy writ. The Reverend accepted it cautiously. "Your poem," she nodded. "It's not just a poem. It's a record, a way to remind people that truth hides not only in evidence but in feeling. The attic, the candlelight. I saw something. Whether it was real or not, it meant something. Marx read the opening lines in silence. A window closed, a candle burned. A name in shadows gently turned. He looked up. You want me to read this at Sunday service? Lydia smiled mischievously. No, dear Reverend, but I would like it archived at the Historical Trust, tucked beside all those letters and ledgers. I want her remembered properly. Miss Barrington, he asked, surprised. Lydia's voice softened. She frightened me, but she was real, and terrible, and sad. People deserve to be remembered for all their parts, not only the polished ones. Reverend Marx considered the words. Very well. I'll speak to the trustees. They may roll their eyes, but I suspect they'll file it. She beamed. That's all I ask. Meanwhile, in London, Poirot sat at his breakfast table, stirring sugar into his coffee when the Morning Post arrived. Among the envelopes was one addressed in a familiar looping hand. Lydia Gray. Linwood. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper, handwritten in violet ink. Monsieur Poirot. You may be pleased or perhaps dismayed to hear I have immortalized the late Miss Barrington in verse. I am calling it The House on Ivy Lane, although I toyed with gaslight elegy for a time. I suspect your excellent mustaches will twitch at some of my liberties with fact. But I have ensured your character appears only as a silhouette of intelligence and patience. You deserve more, but I fear it may have made the poem less interesting. I do hope our paths cross again, ideally under more cheerful circumstances. But if not, know that you were right about one thing. The attic was only the theatre. The tragedy was already written. Yours, Lydia Gray. Poirot read the letter twice, a small smile forming at the corners of his mouth. Then, carefully, he folded it and placed it with the others in the Barrington file. He murmured to himself, the poet sees what the detective confirms. In Linwood, the trust finally agreed to include Lydia's poem in the Barrington archive filed. At the back, behind property deeds and war correspondence. But Lydia didn't mind. She only asked for a single copy to be placed in the drawing room of the manor. Once the house opened to the public, weeks passed. By early November, the house reopened as a heritage site. Visitors came for the architecture, the family portraits, and the attic of tragedy, now roped off but visible through glass. A plaque near the stairwell bore a brief, neutral inscription, Eleanor Barrington, 1870 to 1938, local historian and benefactor, died under tragic circumstances. The home was bequeathed for cultural preservation. Below it sat bound visitors. Copy of The House on Ivy Lane by Lydia Gray. Most skimmed past it, but a few read the lines slowly. Back in London, Poirot received a second letter, this time from Harriet Foyle. Dear Monsieur Poirot, Lavenham is peaceful. The family I work for are kind, and the children well behaved. I have taken up gardening again, and the nights are finally dreamless. I saw your name mentioned in a small piece in the Essex paper about the Barrington house. Reopening, they called it a fine example of rural heritage. But I hope people also remember the truth, the full, uncomfortable truth, not just the gossip, but the loneliness, too. Thank you for seeing me clearly when I felt invisible. Yours sincerely, Harriet Foyle Poirot closed the letter slowly, reflecting once more on all those he'd met during the case: the Reverend, the poet, the broken brother, the woman who guarded her name like a sword, and the shadows. Now quiet, he returned to his coffee and opened his case journal. With his fountain pen, he wrote in neat script across the top of the page: Case No. 438. The shadow in the Atikvan, beneath it, resolved, but not forgotten. Chapter 11. The inspector's regret rain had just begun to fall over Essex when Inspector Harwood arrived back at Barrington Manor. He hadn't intended to return. The case was closed. Gregory Barrington had been transferred to a secure facility pending formal indictment, and Linwood had resumed its quiet rhythm. But something, perhaps the stubborn voice of conscience, had drawn him back. He stood alone in the main hall, now devoid of its former life. A guide's table had been installed by the door, stacked with leaflets. The heavy scent of polish hung in the air, freshly applied by preservation staff. Only the staircase remained untouched, roped off with thick velvet cord. Harwood looked up toward the attic door above. Still locked, he muttered. A young assistant emerged from the side hallway. "Can I help you, sir?" Harwood showed his credentials. "Inspector Harwood. I oversaw the Barrington case. Thought I'd have a look before the public comes." Crawling in with curiosity, she nodded quickly. "Of course. There's a private file in the study. Curator kept aside a few items related to the investigation. You're welcome to review them." He followed her through the familiar rooms, past portraits that now felt oddly still, as if their painted eyes were relieved of duty. In the study, he found a small folder on the desk marked "Supplementary," not "for exhibit." Harwood opened it. Inside was a carbon copy of Gregory's signed confession, a photograph of the gas valve from the attic, and a transcript of Poirot's initial interview notes. But one page sat atop the rest, newly added a memorandum dated a week prior to the Trust Archive Board. The attached letter was located beneath the trunk lining during final cataloguing. Though it is not directly relevant to the central investigation, we believe it should be retained for its psychological insight into the Barrington household. C. Statham, historical consultant. Wood unfolded the letter. It was in Gregory's hand, addressed but never sent to his sister. Eleanor. I never meant for it to end this way. You pushed and pushed. You always did. But it was never about the money. Not really. I only wanted to be seen again as I was before the war, before everything broke inside my head. You kept my secrets, yes, but you used them like a leash, and I let you. Because I didn't know how to live without your permission. But then you threatened to strip away what little I had left, and I panicked. I don't even remember lighting the candle. I only remember the silence, the cold, the weight of it all. If anyone finds this, I am sorry, not for myself, but for what I've become. G. Harwood read the letter twice, then lowered it slowly onto the desk. He sank into the worn chair behind it, pressing his fingers to his temples. All this time, he'd believed Gregory to be merely bitter, a man pushed to crime by inheritance and insult. But this letter revealed something else entirely, something deeper. A man fractured by war, mishandled by his own family, crushed under the years of silence. Harwood whispered, "We failed him long before the attic." That afternoon, he walked through the village. The butcher gave a curt nod. The baker looked away. Harwood understood his role in the Barrington affair had not won him any admiration. He had doubted Poirot. He had scoffed at shadows. And though justice had technically been served, something in the manner of it now felt incomplete. He reached the churchyard just as the drizzle thinned into mist. Reverend Marks was tidying the small garden near the vestry, pruning a rose bush that seemed far too defiant for the season. Harwood approached quietly. Reverend Marks looked up, surprised. "Inspector." "Back again?" Harwood offered a weak smile. "One last visit." Marks dusted his gloves on his coat. "I read Lydia's poem. It's haunting." Harwood nodded. "More honest than my reports." Marks tilted his head. "Guilt, Inspector?" "Reflection," Harwood replied. "I followed the evidence. Yes, but I dismissed the quiet parts, the ones that couldn't be measured." The Reverend leaned on his spade. "The world rarely gives medals for listening. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it." Harwood's eyes settled on the church steeple rising above the mist. "Do you believe Eleanor meant to drive him mad?" Marks sighed. "I believe she thought she was keeping him safe. But her love, if you can call it that, was made of fear. And fear is a terrible foundation." They stood in silence, listening to the hush of wet leaves. Harwood finally asked, "Do you believe in redemption, Reverend?" Marks smiled faintly. "I have to, or I'd never open my mouth on Sunday mornings." That evening, Harwood penned a private memo to his superior. "Regarding the Barrington case, I submit that while the facts support the charge and confession, additional context suggests Gregory Barrington was a man long suffering from post-traumatic stress exacerbated by psychological control within his domestic environment. This should be considered in any sentencing discussion. The late Miss Barrington's role in his condition, while not criminal, was, in my opinion, morally culpable." Submitted for the record. Inspector L. Harwood had placed the memo in a sealed envelope, marked confidential, and slid it into his briefcase. As he turned out the light in his office, he paused by the door, hand resting on the knob. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace, not because he had solved the case, but because he had finally understood it. Chapter 12. The Candle and the Keith Barrington Attic, now sealed to the public, remained untouched behind a thick pane of glass and a brass plaque that read, "Private Area. Preservation in Progress." Yet even as tourists passed by the staircase with polite curiosity, something lingered, a feeling not quite dread, but unfinishedness, as if the room still held a breath that had never been exhaled. Harriet Foyle, returning for one final appointment with the trust archivist, had asked gently, almost timidly, if she might see the attic once more. To her surprise, they agreed. "I'll be brief," she promised, as the guide handed her the heavy brass key. Just a moment. The stairs groaned beneath her as she climbed. They always had, even when she tiptoed on them as a younger maid. At the top, The door resisted for a second, then yielded with a reluctant click. The attic was just as she remembered. The gas lamp fixtures had been removed. The old trunk sat beneath a clear dust cloth. Sunlight fell through the far window in a jagged rectangle, illuminating motes of dust dancing like faint ghosts. Harriet stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. She approached the trunk and slowly pulled the dust cloth away. Her eyes lingered on the space where the hidden letters had been found. She ran her fingers along the edge. Then, without quite meaning to, she knelt and reached beneath the floorboards there, where the candle stub had once rolled something. Cold met her fingers, a small iron key. Her breath caught it was not ornate or decorative. Functional, plain, and old, she stood, turning it over in her palm. What had Eleanor hidden that no one else had found? Harriet's eyes swept the room once more. Then she saw it, behind the stack of broken luggage cases. Tucked into the wall near the chimney stack was a panel. It was flush with the plaster, but the edges revealed faint drag marks as though it had been opened before, years ago. With her heart thudding quietly, Harriet crossed the room and pressed her fingers against it. It gave with a reluctant creak. Behind it, dusty, but intact, was a wooden compartment no larger than a drawer. She inserted the key. A tiny click echoed in the silence. Inside the compartment was a single object, a candle, untouched, unused, and wrapped in a linen handkerchief embroidered with the initials E.B. to days later. The object lay on Poirot's desk. He turned it slowly in his gloved hands, studying every inch of the wax, the wick, the cloth. Harriet sat opposite him, explaining softly, "I didn't know what to make of it. I thought perhaps she left it for someone, or herself." Poirot nodded. A second candle. Not the one used in the attic the night of her death. Inspector Harwood recorded that clearly. This one was never lit. Harriet's eyes held a question. What does it mean? Poirot placed the candle down. It means she planned more than we knew. Harriet frowned. You think she knew Gregory would try something? No, Poirot said carefully. I think she planned to frighten him. Perhaps one final warning. The attic, the candle, the hidden documents. She meant it as theater. But something went wrong, Harriet whispered. We, Poirot replied. Perhaps she lit the other candle too soon, or too late. Perhaps he found her before she could control the moment. He looked again at the unlit candle. She had rehearsed it, he said quietly. This was the prop she would keep in reserve. Eleanor Barrington was not one for improvisation. Harriet's voice was hushed. So the attic wasn't a trap. It was a performance, one that turned fatal. Poirot nodded solemnly, and the final scene did not follow the script. Later, that evening, Poirot penned a private note for his case file. The discovery of the second candle suggests premeditation, not of murder, but manipulation. Miss Barrington likely intended to scare her brother into compliance once again. The attic, the letter, the candle, these were her stage directions. But she misjudged the depth of his despair, or perhaps the strength of his resolve. She thought herself in control until the very end. But fear, once kindled, rarely obeys its master. He folded the note and placed it with the others. Then he reached for the small linen cloth, still faintly scented with lavender and age. He laid it carefully into a sealed envelope marked attic. Final findings. Meanwhile in Linwood. The attic was locked again, this time permanently. The trust agreed to seal the hidden drawer as a historical curiosity, without revealing its contents to the public. Harriet returned to Lavenham with a clearer heart, though the candle's weight lingered in her memory. As for the village, the tale of the Barrington family faded into softer legend whispers exchanged between generations. Facts softened by distance. Miss Lydia Gray, ever the guardian of myth and memory, added a final verse to her poem. She lit the wick, but not the flame, her theatre dark. Her actors blamed, and in that hush, the moment broke, a life undone by words unspoke. When asked if she would publish it, Lydia only smiled. "Let it rest where it belongs," she said, "in the attic, with the candle, and the truth only some will ever know." Chapter 13. Whispered in Linwood. Frost had returned to Linwood. It dusted the hedgerows and lingered on the church roof in the early morning, making the village feel somehow quieter, more introspective. Time, like the mist, moved differently. Here at the Cockerel and Chime, the village's modest pub talk had begun to shift away from the Barrington affair. The house was no longer the place of dread. It had become a curiosity once more, a stop on a local heritage walk, somewhere between the old mill and the stone bridge over Carrow Brook. But not everyone had moved on. In the corner of the pub, tucked beside the fireplace, two older villagers spoke in hushed tones over weak ale. "It warn't the gas, I'm telling you," said the elder of the two, a man named Bramley. She knew he'd come for her. That candle was a signal. His companion, a dour woman named Miss Archer, shook her head. She didn't expect him to do it. That's the tragedy. She always thought she'd win. She never imagined he'd break. Still, Bramley muttered, "Don't seem right. All that hush-hush. The trust never did explain what was in that drawer." Archer sipped her drink. "Miss Gray says it was another candle." Bramley scoffed. "Poetic. That, poetic and true aren't always the same." Archer said. Across the room, Miss Lydia Gray sat at her usual table, sipping tea from a chipped blue cup, her notebook unopened before her. She wasn't listening, but she was remembering. Later that week, Lydia made her way to the church, not for service, but to speak with Reverend Marks. He received her in the small chapel office, where dust motes swirled in shafts of cold light. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about the nature of stories." Marks looked up from his writing. "Go on." "We remember the parts that explain things," she continued. "The sharp lines, the neat endings, Gregory's confession, Eleanor's control, the candle. But what of the rest? The emotion of it?" He set his pen down. "You think something's missing?" Lydia hesitated. "Not a fact, a feeling. I keep asking myself, was there ever a moment they might have forgiven one another? Before the attic." Marks considered. "Perhaps. But Eleanor needed control, and Gregory needed freedom. Neither knew how to ask the other for mercy." Lydia looked down at her notebook. "That's the poem I haven't written." He leaned back. Perhaps that one isn't meant for words. She smiled faintly. Perhaps not. Far from Linwood, Poirot sat in his London study, arranging his final thoughts for the case file. The envelope containing the unlit candle and handkerchief now rested in a secure drawer, labeled discreetly and locked. He glanced at the fire crackling in the hearth. Then he turned back to his journal. The true tragedy of the Barrington affair lies not in the method of death, but in the erosion of trust between siblings who once, perhaps, loved each other. Eleanor Barrington wielded power like a gavel, believing it preserved order. Gregory Barrington crumbled beneath it, shamed and silenced for decades. But neither acted purely from malice. Each was shaped by war, by loss, by expectation. And in that attic stage, confessional, and tomb, their final scene played not as murder, but as collapse. He paused. Then wrote one final line. It is not always the guilty who fall. Sometimes it is merely the weaker soul in the wrong moment. He closed the journal and rested his hand atop the leather cover. Outside, the wind stirred. In Linwood, preparations began for the winter fair. The school children practised carols, and bunting was strung from post to post. The air was lighter now, more forgiving. The attic at Barrington Manor remained locked. Visitors passed through the house, reading the Trust's carefully curated placards. Some stopped to view Lydia Gray's poem, displayed quietly on the parlour table. Most moved on without comment. But one afternoon, a child paused. She stood for several long minutes, reading the poem aloud to herself, lips moving with each line. Her mother called for her, but the girl lingered. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Mummy, why was she sad?" Her mother glanced back, unsure how to answer. But Lydia, standing nearby, replied quietly, "Because sometimes even the strongest people are lonely." The child nodded. Then ran to catch up with her mother. Lydia remained where she stood, notebook clutched to her chest. No more verses came. Not yet, but perhaps one day they would. Chapter 14. Poirot's final note of envelope was a pale ivory, thick and weighted. The handwriting was unmistakably Poirot's, precise, symmetrical, each loop and stroke carefully placed. It arrived in Linwood just after the frost began to melt, carried not by a postman but by private courier, addressed simply to Miss Lydia Gray, Linwood Cottage, Ivy Lane, Essex. Lydia found it resting gently on her writing desk, delivered by her housekeeper. With a curious glance, she hesitated before opening it. Poirot rarely wrote for idle reasons. Inside was a single folded sheet, and tucked within, a page from his own journal marked Case No. For 3 the shadow in the attic. She began to read. See here, Mademoiselle Gray. I write not with facts, but with reflections. The case, as far as law is concerned, has ended. Yet we both know that endings are rarely so firm as courtrooms would like to pretend. I have continued to think of Eleanor and Gregory Barrington not as symbols of guilt or tragedy, but as two souls bound by the weight of memory. You once said that the attic was only a theatre, and I have come to believe you were right. It was a place of confession, of performance, and, ultimately, of collapse. Gregory's act was not one of pure malice. It was desperation in the face of a trap he had lived within for too long. Eleanor's control, though severe, was rooted in fear of the world, of scandal, of letting go. Both were prisoners of the past. You, Miss Grey, have captured what no legal record ever could: the sorrow beneath the surface, the tone between the notes. Your verses are kinder than their actions, but truer to their natures. I enclose one final observation. Should it prove of use to your pen, it concerns the candle. Asterisk, not the one found. The other, the one lit that night. Lydia paused, eyes widening. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the second sheet. It was from Poirot's personal case notes, rarely shared. Asterisk, upon revisiting the original gas fitting from the attic retained briefly by the trust, I observed that the valve had not been fully opened. It had been turned just enough to release a faint scent, but not enough to be fatal unless left burning for hours. A curious detail, one that at first appeared irrelevant, but when paired with Eleanor Barrington's rehearsal candle never lit and the letter Harriet found, it suggests something subtler. Eleanor did not intend to kill. She intended to frighten, yes, but not to the point of danger. The low gas flow and lit candle would cause discomfort, confusion, perhaps even guilt. A symbolic gesture. One final. Listen to her brother. Asterisk, but she did not expect Gregory to enter so soon, or for him to panic. He did not realize the gas was already present. He may have snuffed the flame in fear, but by then she had already succumbed. Not from poison, from shock, from the blow. She lit the stage, but forgot the audience might not follow the script. She lost control of her own scene. Asterisk, Lydia let out a slow breath, eyes fixed on the last line. Poirot's note ended with a signature and a small postscript. If you ever write again, Miss Grey, remember, even in fiction, the truth can whisper louder than fact. Hercule Poirot. Lydia folded the pages and placed them in the small drawer, where she kept her most private pieces tucked beside her mother's locket and an old school prize certificate from decades ago. She stood and walked to her window. The village stretched before her rooftops, slick with dew, chimney smoke rising in calm spirals, and a handful of children skipping stones down by the stream. Normality had returned. But for Lydia, the story wasn't quite done. Not yet. She fetched her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and began to write, not in verse, but in prose, a small story of a woman who lit a candle too soon, of a man who entered too late, of a tragedy written not in blood, but in silence. Elsewhere, Poirot closed his own journal and placed it gently onto the shelf marked retired cases. He did not dwell. He had never been one to linger in past sadness, but he honored it. He poured himself a small glass of cordial, stood by the window, and watched the London street lamps flicker on, one by one. Another shadow, put to rest. Back in Linwood, the attic remained sealed. But in the quiet hours, when the wind sighed through the trees, the villagers sometimes said they saw a flicker behind the glass, a glimmer of candlelight, a faint echo of breath. Most dismissed it, but a few, like Lydia, understood. Some shadows don't haunt. They simply remain, waiting to be remembered. Chapter 15. curtain call at Ivy Leneath Barrington House stood quietly under a sky veiled in winter grey. The frost had grown bolder now, crusting the garden gates and turning the ivy to crystal. Inside, the final touches for the public exhibition were being made, audio guides tested, glass cases wiped clean, and nameplates straightened by meticulous hands. But in a small side room, tucked behind the study once ruled by Eleanor Barrington, a gathering of quiet purpose had been arranged. 3 people sat at a long oak table: Lydia Gray, Harriet Foyle, and Reverend Marks. They had come at Poirot's request, though the great detective himself had, as he put it, no need to retell the past aloud. Instead, he had entrusted Lydia with the task of sharing his final reflections. She held his letter in her hand, not the earlier one but a fresh note, marked simply, for Linwood to be read once only. She unfolded it carefully, her voice steady as she began. My dear friends, I thank you for attending this small gathering. It is not for dramatic effect but for completion. A story, you see, must not only end. It must be understood. The truth of Eleanor Barrington's death lies not in malice, but in miscalculation. She did not plan to die that night. She planned a demonstration, a performance. She believed Gregory, once faced with the tangible weight of his own shame, would retreat, that he would yield once more to her control. She wrote the threatening letter. She set the stage in the attic. She released the gas gently, not to kill, but to unsettle. And she lit the candle, the real candle, not the one Harriet found, a theatrical cue. But Gregory came too soon, too frightened. The smell of gas, the sight of the candle, her voice perhaps rehearsed too harshly. It broke something in him, and in a moment of fear, not premeditated violence, he struck. Once, not to kill, but enough to silence. Eleanor fell. The gas, now unchecked, hissed its way into the room, and by the time Gregory understood what he had done, it was too late to save her. Lydia paused. Harriet's hands trembled lightly in her lap. Reverend Marks sat still, eyes closed, absorbing every word. She continued. This is not to pardon Gregory Barrington, but it is to say that his crime, terrible as it was, came not from hatred but desperation. A man fractured long ago, held together by the threadbare ropes of fear, guilt, and dependency. And Eleanor, she was not a monster. She was a woman who believed she was holding the world together with her hands, a keeper of secrets, a master of silence. But silence, Ms. can echo louder than screams. Lydia folded the note. That's all, she said quietly. That's everything. No one spoke for a moment. Then Reverend Marks said softly, So, in the end, they both lost. Lydia nodded. Yes, but not without meaning, not without warning. Harriet looked down at her hands. She never meant to die, and he never meant to kill. And yet, Marks said, death came for them both, one by force, the other by consequence. The Barrington house opened fully to the public 1 week later. The attic was still off-limits, but beneath its stairwell stood a small display, curated by the Trust with discretion and care. A sealed glass case held 3 objects: a photograph of Eleanor Barrington, young and unsmiling, a folded piece of lace, once used to wrap the rehearsal candle dot, and a copy of Lydia Gray's poem, The House on Ivy Lane. A short plaque read, asterisk in memory of a family undone not by greed or hatred, but by the weight of silence. May we remember that truth is not only what is proven. Sometimes it is what remains unspoken. Poirot never returned to Linwood. He declined the Trust's invitation to attend the exhibition's opening. Instead, he sent a brief telegram to Lydia. The final act played true. Curtain drawn, H.P. She smiled when she read it, not because it was clever, but because it was right. Years later, long after the house had faded into just another historical stop, a child visiting the manor stopped beside the staircase. She peered up at the attic door and asked, "Is there still a ghost up there?" Her mother laughed and shook her head. "Don't be silly." But Lydia, now older and grayer, visiting quietly that same day, heard the question and answered gently, from behind, "Not a ghost, my dear, just a shadow." The girl turned. Of what? Lydia smiled. Of people who forgot how to speak to each other, and of what happens when words are left too long in the dark. The girl blinked, unsure if it was a riddle or a warning, but she remembered it long after they left Ivy Lane. Asterisk.